specialized in adolescent, youth, and adult health. She worked as a department for maternal, newborn, child, and adolescent health and aging at WHO Geneva in Switzerland. I just was telling her that I met some of her colleagues last week, and I have the pleasure to meet you now over here. Dr. Regina, she's a PhD, is a scientist working on adolescent health, monitoring and evaluation in the Department for Maternal, Newborn and Child and Adolescent Health at the World Health Organization. She holds a PhD in health sciences along with a 2 master's degree in public health and in sport sciences, and that's why she fit perfectly for this position. Regina has over 15 years of work experience in surveillance, monitoring and evaluation of adolescent and adult health with focus on physical activity. She has supported a lot of government in over 50 countries around the world in the implementation of surveillance system. Regina is passionate about improving the health of population globally through better understanding and using health data, and through supporting positive changes in the environment to make a healthy choice, an easy choice for people. So she'll be talking today about the global policy marker in the field of physical activity and health promotion. I have the pleasure to introduce you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to this Congress. It's a great pleasure to be here in such a nice place. Thank you. My presentation today, as you have seen, has the title, What do we know about global levels of insufficient physical activity? This is an overview of the presentation. I will be talking very briefly about some of the definitions. What is physical activity? What is sedentary behavior? And about the health effects of both. I will be presenting the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior, and then go into describing global levels and trends of different populations meeting or not meeting these guidelines. And then I will briefly talk about the WHO Global Action Plan on Physical Activity, the GAPA, some of the toolkits, and the progress in countries. I'll go straight into presenting some of the definitions, and this is how some of these terms are defined in the WHO guidelines on physical activity. So physical activity, as per the WHO definition, really is any bodily movement produced by the muscles of the body. It does not matter if it is physical activity to get from A to B, transport, or sport, or physical activity for work. Any movement counts as physical activity. Sedentary behavior is defined as any waking behavior that is characterized by a very low energy expenditure, like sitting or reclining or lying down, but not sleeping. Aerobic physical activity is activity in which the body's large muscles move in a rhythmic manner for a sustained, for a longer period of time. For example, running, walking, cycling. That's also called endurance activity. And then there's different intensities of physical activity. Moderate physical activity is of a little bit lower intensity, but still makes you breathe and sweat. And vigorous intensity physical activity is when you move fast and you breathe a lot and your heart beats very fast. Finally, muscle strengthening activity is the activity that increases the muscle strength. Just some of the definitions, because I will be using some of these terms in my presentation. Many of you probably know exactly the health effects of physical activity and sedentary behavior. We all know physical activity is good for health. It reduces mortality from all causes and from cardiovascular disease. It reduces morbidity, that means getting ill from specific types of cancers, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and overweight, obesity. It reduces falls and related injuries. Physical activity improves bone health and functional ability and mental and cognitive health and quality of life, and it improves fitness. That's broadly the health effects of physical activity. On the other hand, we know from many scientific studies that sedentary behavior, sitting a lot, is bad for health. In children, it has negative effects on overweight, obesity, cardiometabolic health, fitness, behavioral conduct, and sleep. But also sitting too much in adults increases the mortality, and it increases morbidity from cardiovascular disease-specific cancers and type 2 diabetes. This is the flip side of physical activity. Sedentary behavior has negative impacts. All of this big body of evidence was considered when the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior were developed. The first iteration was developed in 2010, and in 2020 these guidelines have been updated. These guidelines include recommendations for different population groups: adults and older adults, children and adolescents aged 5 to 17 years, and several population subgroups such as pregnant women, people with chronic conditions, or children, adults with a disability. These are the population groups that have recommendations in the guidelines. I will describe what are exactly these recommendations, but most importantly probably is that every move counts. That's one of the big messages in the guidelines, that if people move more, they do something good for their health. Every move counts. Doing some physical activity, even a little bit, is better than not doing any. The specific guidelines for adults and older adults are to do at least 150 minutes of moderate physical activity per week. This is roughly 30 minutes on 5 days each week. Or, if you're vigorously active, you can do a little bit less. More intensity, less time, only 75 minutes per week. That's the main recommendation. If people do more, there is a greater benefit. This is the longest standing physical activity guideline with a lot of scientific evidence behind it. But there are more recommendations. There is also a recommendation for additional health benefits. Adults and older adults should do at least 2 days a week with muscle strengthening activities. And they should In addition, older adults on 3 days a week should do activities for their strength and balance. So this is for adults and older adults. Here are the guidelines for children and adolescents. They should do at least 60 minutes per day across the week of moderate or vigorous physical activity, 1 hour a day. But it doesn't matter if they do 1 hour each day, or if they do 1 day nothing, and then the next day they do 2 hours. As long as they do, on average, 1 hour each day. They should also do 3 days a week of vigorous intensity physical activity that makes them sweat and breathe hard. And they should limit the amount of time spent sitting, especially sitting and screen use. Now, what does it look like? Do people meet these recommendations? Do people do enough globally? Here is a graph that is for adults, 18 years and older. You can see at the bottom the year, 2001, with projections to 2028. Blue is men, red is women. You see about women, 32% of women around the world do not meet this main physical activity recommendation. They do less than 150 minutes of moderate activity per week. And the trend has been flat, no improvement. If we continue the trend, it will stay flat. But there are physical activity targets that countries have agreed on, WHO member states have agreed on. The targets, if the targets were to be met, these levels should improve. But if nothing is done, the trend will stay flat and the targets won't be met. Men are doing a little bit better. Globally, it's about 23% of men that do not meet the physical activity guidelines, and the trend is improving a little bit. But again, if the trend continues, this target that was set by the WHO member states will not be met. The target is to reduce inactivity by 15% by the year 2030. Just to note that these estimates are from the year 2016, and they have been updated this year, but they're not published yet. The new numbers, they will be published later this year. What does this look like in the different countries? Now, this is a map of the world, and this is for men. Here you can see the percentage of men in each country not meeting the guidelines. Not meeting the guidelines. If it's yellow, the percentage is less than 30% of men not meeting the guidelines. The darker the color gets, the bigger the percentage of men not meeting the guidelines. You can see, for example, one of the countries with the highest percentages of men not meeting the guidelines are Brazil, Saudi Arabia, but also Germany. So this is men. Keep this in mind. And remember, the brighter the color, the more active the country. The darker the color, the less active. the colors change. It gets much darker overall. Again, we see that the percentage of women not meeting the guidelines is higher than the percentage of men. A lot of red color in North Africa, but also in the Americas. Many women not meeting the guidelines. But as I said before, there are different components to the guidelines. There are also guidelines for muscle strengthening, to do that on at least 2 days a week, and for balance on at least 3 days a week. Now there is much less data, much less information on these components of the guidelines. In terms of muscle strengthening, there is one study that included 5 countries, and that showed that about 20% of people meet these guidelines for muscle strengthening, but 80% don't. But for many countries, there is no information. Also for balance, there is basically no data, very, very little data globally. Finally, the last component was sitting. Remember, adults are supposed to limit sitting time. Here, this shows where data are available. 62 countries do have data from the last 10 years. Roughly, you can see the countries in color on this map, countries with data. The median sitting time per day was about 5 hours, but only for these countries. And the median means that half of the population does less than 5 hours and half of the population does more than 5 hours of sitting. This is an average, but again, sitting, there is very little data. But what the study also showed is that the richer a country, the higher the sitting time. Now, what does the picture look like in adolescence? Adolescence, this is for boys. Again, this map shows the percentage of those not meeting the guidelines. Blue, these are the best countries, but still less than 75%. So globally, there is a very large percentage of adolescents that do not meet the 1 hour per day. It's about 80% of adolescents that do not meet the guidelines. And this is 11 to 17-year-olds, again from the year 2016. Green is 75 to 85%, and then yellow and red is over 85% of adolescents not meeting the guidelines. Again, this is adolescent boys. I will now switch to girls. Look how the colors change. This is girls. So many more countries turn yellow and red, meaning the percentage of those not meeting the guidelines gets higher. And again, we see a lot North Africa, but also Europe, Australia, South America, also many countries, over 85% of adolescents not meeting the guidelines. Again, these estimates are being updated this year. Just some information on the COVID-19 pandemic. There has been a systematic review and a meta-analysis on how physical activity behavior among adolescents has changed during the COVID-19 pandemic. The study included really 22 studies from 20